Welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to prepare a set of pistons to go into your snowmobile engine, or really any engine for that matter. And one of the biggest things that we're going to have to worry about is ring gap. So this is a cylinder off of a 493 Rotax, which would have been like a 2000 to 2003 Ski-Doo engine, maybe a little bit outside of that as well. But this also applies to pretty much every engine of this series. So the 493, 593, 693, 793. So 500, 600, 700, 800. Now, what I've got here is a aftermarket, straight from Taiwan set of rings and piston. This is a single ring motor. If you notice on the ring pack itself, it is labeled as top. Now, I'm not going to totally follow their directions exactly, but I'm going to bring this ring in. I'm going to set it into the bore. And I'm going to use my piston, and I'm going to try to drive it down to just above the exhaust port. I'm using the piston so that I can keep this nice and level. Okay, because we want that ring to be in there perfectly square, perfectly level. So that's going to be an alright spot. And I need a light. Okay, now you can see in here there's a little bit of a notch out. On any two-stroke piston, there's going to be a notch in the piston, and it's got a steel pin that I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see or not. But there's a pin that sticks out, and what that does is it keeps the ring from moving around on the piston. And that's what that is. Now there's also a little bit more of a notch that goes in there in the center. These are SPI cheapo pistons, and I am going to have to fit them to the cylinder. So make sure you actually measure this gap. Now I've got 16 thousandths and 22 thousandths feeler gauges pulled out. The spec on these rings for all of the engines is 16 to 39 thousandths of an inch. Generally speaking, the larger the cylinder gets, the more of a ring gap you need, because as that material heats up, it actually closes the gap up more. So because this is the smallest bore out of this series, I'm going to try to keep it in that 16 to 22 range. So if that 16 fits and the 22 doesn't, that means that I hit that spot. Right now, the 16 does not fit. That's a very small gap at the moment. So I'm going to have to take this ring and I'm going to grind it. So what I've got here clamped in the vise is just a really simple hand-operated ring filing tool. So you can buy these pretty much anywhere that sells automotive performance stuff. But I'm going to have to take this, I'm going to have to grind off the insides of this ring to open up the gap and hopefully make it fit. You can do this by hand with a file. If you do that, you want to be very careful to try to keep those as square as you can. So I'm going to take this ring, set it against these pins, move it in a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to go back and measure this. I'm going to come back and forth several times. I don't feel like moving the camera. So I'm going to go back, put this back in the cylinder just like I did before, and measure that same gap. Alright, so I just measured it. It was actually really close. So I'm going to do just a real small amount. Okay, and we'll go ahead, and it was close enough that I think that's honestly going to have it. So I'll take the camera back this time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and reinstall this. Take the piston again. Okay. Take my 16 thousandths feeler gauge. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that or not. But the 16 thousandths feeler gauge now slips in between there. I don't think the 22 will. Nope, the 22 will not. So I could spend time figuring out exactly what it is, but it's between 16 and 22, and that's close enough for me. Now there's actually several things you want to consider when you're setting up your ring gap. If the engine's going to be run in an abusive manner, you want a little bit bigger gap. If you've got a larger bore, you want a little bit bigger gap. It actually kind of surprises me that they've spec'd the exact same gap for the 500 all the way up through the 800, because there's a fairly big difference in piston size between the two. But that's what they did. So because this is the smaller bore, I'm going to gap it a little bit smaller. As the ring wears and the cylinder wears, that gap will get larger. So that's another reason why I'm leaving it on the small side. So we're just going to go ahead. We'll call that good. Hopefully that's big enough. If I get really abusive to this engine, then I'm going to kind of wish I would have gone a little bit bigger on the ring gap. But I don't really think that's going to happen. So we're going to go ahead, leave it at this. But we're not quite done yet. Now you can't really see it, but if you feel these edges, there's a little bit of a burr. And that burr is from using that gapping tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab one of my old pistons as a stand for right now, and I'm going to take a file. And I'm just going to very gently remove those burrs from this ring. Okay, so all I've done is done just a real light file on all of these edges. There's no burr left, so this is now ready to install. But before I do that, I'm going to show you the piston retaining ring. So I've already got this ring installed in the other piston, and it is on that side, so we'll go with this side. So I'm going to put a retaining ring in this side of the piston. And what I'll do when I go to do that is actually grab one of the wrist pins. So I'll just grab one of the piston pins, and I'm going to kind of install that a little bit into the piston itself. I'm going to grab a socket. This one happens to be an 11mm, but it doesn't really matter. Now when you go to install these rings into a piston, you want them to face with the gap either down or up. They don't really want you to put that gap in other spots. So these rings are kind of a pain to put in. I'm just going to kind of work it around. Actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that pin back a little bit. I'm going to drop the piston or the ring in a little. And I will use this socket to kind of gently work the ring the rest of the way in. Okay. So now this bottom end of the ring is down. Actually, I shoved it in too far, but it's inside that lock groove. So now I'm going to take the pin, and I'm actually going to use the pin to push it back into place. I hate these pins. I really do. But I've got my gap straight down, which is where I want it. So now this piston, the other side, I will need to install once the piston is on the engine. So as of right now, I've got one of my retaining rings in. I've got the ring ready to go, which I'll go ahead and there's going to be some type of marking that indicates top or bottom. This one just says top right there. Now, as I said, these two-stroke pistons actually have a pin that aligns the ring. That's to keep the rings from ending up... Man, that coating on the top of that piston does not look very pretty. But anyway, the pin on these pistons is to keep the ring from sliding around and catching in a port, which the two-stroke cylinders have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this marker, and I'm just going to put a little dot where that is. One of the things I want to do before I actually put this in the engine, these arrows point towards the exhaust port. So the exhaust port is right there. The arrow points right towards it. These pistons actually come up from the bottom. I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see this, but you want to point that arrow directly at the exhaust port, and then you want to watch this come up. And if this pin lines up with any of the windows, you're going to have a bad time because those rings are going to catch and break. So, and honestly, this one might have a problem. So I'm going to look underneath. I'm going to line it up side to side there. So that should be roughly where it sits on the engine. I'm going to hold it in place, flip it over, and boy, that's close, huh? But it looks like it's hitting the bridge between those ports. So I think this is going to be okay. I think that it looks like it runs right down between these two ports and then close to that ring as well. So we don't want the ring gap to end up in any of these windows, or it's going to cause the ring to catch in there and then break off. And when it catches in there and breaks off, it also destroys the cylinder. Actually, looking at how I marked it, I feel better about it because the pin is really more to this side of the mark. So that's going to go probably right up the center. I think it's fine. So now we'll take our ring, make sure that the top part is marked up. Okay, so top is marked up. I will start it just to the other side of the mark. I'm going to lift up slightly and I'm going to roll this ring around. So after I roll it around, I'll just kind of follow it with my finger. Push it down into its groove, and there it is. Now when installed, these ring gaps, or this pin, will hold the ring right where it's supposed to be, with the gap right there. Alright, so I've got the circlip installed, the ring is fitted, and unfortunately I can't put this on the engine today because I got the wrong pin bearings. So this is really about as far as I'm going to be able to go with this top end for now. And hopefully early next week I'll actually have parts to finish assembling this engine. So that's prepping a piston to be installed in specifically a two-stroke, but really that more or less applies to every engine. So thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you later.